The first step for TiPCASTT is to look at the title. And clearly the title is the word winter. But it makes me wonder, is this going to be a description? When I think of winter, I think of fun, like sledding and snowballs. But of course, winter also has other connotations. Possibly it's cold and people are stuck inside, so maybe it's cold and oppressive. Now the next step is to read through the poem a few times, and so I'll do that a few times, and then after that I start to paraphrase each of the ideas. So the first idea is right here with those first few lines that end with the end stop. And what I see there is that winter has held the people captive, but now he's gone. And then the next full idea really comes from here. And what I see is that these birds follow him, the marsh hawk and the crow. The next full idea continues essentially until this full stop here. And what I see is that the speaker says people would think that spring would bring happiness. That final part, I tell you no, we must be captive still until the full stop. It tells me that no, spring didn't bring happiness. They're still somehow affected by winter. The next step is to look at the figurative language, the connotations and the figurative language there. Well, it's pretty clear that both winter and spring are being personified. And in fact, it seems like winter is something that traps them or trips them up. I want to look a bit closer at these aspects of figurative language. So first, the description of stumbling implies that the people are clearly inferior to the power of winter. But the more interesting one is the simile or the metaphor of who held us long in iron chains of cold. Obviously, iron is something strong and it's chains, and so it's meant to trap them. But also we have that description of it being long as well, and the cold. A little bit later, we see that winter is personified again, but here it's described as having to turn reluctantly. And that makes me think that the speaker believes that winter enjoys trapping people. In fact, we see another description of the ways that he traps people beyond just stumbling feet and iron chains of cold. We see the sharp snares. Snares are traps that are used for animals. And that can highlight the difference in the power between winter and people. What I also see is that the snares themselves are sharp, that they're painful in some way. It's not just that he's captivating them, but he's actually hurting them. Now, as we continue on with the description of winter, winter moves soberly like a dream up slopes and hills. And I think this is helping us to characterize still winter. Here it means that he's very serious, so he goes about his job seriously. And I wonder, why like a dream? Is it something that's faint, that people forget? But what I also notice is that winter finally breathes a last cool sigh before he left. Yeah, I have to ask myself, why would winter be sighing? And I think that means that he's reluctant. He doesn't want to leave. So the next pieces of strong words with strong connotations or figurative language are the symbolic birds we have here. Crow is a bird that symbolizes death, and in some beliefs the crow actually helps bring souls to the land of the dead. And a marsh hawk, this is a predatory bird, and it lives in a marsh, which is a swamp, right? So something rotten, rotting. It's no surprise that these two birds are associated with winter, considering the way winter's been characterized here. Next in the characterization is the idea of spring. Spring is described as having a few actions to eliminate the effects of winter. I think what's interesting about this is we have the initial declaration, heal all wounds. And I don't think these are literal wounds. I think these are metaphorical, emotional. I also like the idea that she breathes freedom on the air. This idea of breathing, it's really natural for her. And freedom, of course, is the opposite, the antithesis of what we saw winter doing. Finally, this description of throw all her singing, that's interesting because, singing, of course, is something intangible. How do you throw it? But it gives this carefree image of her. It's also interesting to note that spring, in this case, is female. And perhaps that means she's nurturing. Of course, the end of that description goes back to the powers of winter. He was what made the air barren. As we continue down into that last part, we see a few interesting connotations and pieces of figurative language. First is that the speaker says we must be captives still. And I think that's pretty straightforward because they were trapped earlier. Next, it's this tricolon of watching each other with winter's look, touch with his hand, and finally speak with his bitter breath. Now, the big question is, what does that mean? How do you watch something with winter's look? Well, we look at how winter has been characterized. It's cold, it's oppressive, it traps people, it's lacking life. So maybe that's it. It's an emotionally cold look. Finally, we have this speak with his bitter breath. And I love that description of bitter there, that perhaps it's not just that you're emotionally cold, but in fact, you're even disdainful of people. The next step is to identify the speaker and the attitude. Well, we can see that, the speaker does refer to himself or herself a couple times in the poem. And we see that with the word I and that we. So the speaker is definitely part of the group, perhaps in some way more knowledgeable. Now, if we look at the tone, very clearly the speaker is trying to almost warn us, in a sense, where we would expect the spring to come and change the emotional attitude of the people experiencing it. But she says very declaratively, I tell you, no, we must be captives still. And indeed, so I believe there's some sort of warning here. At the very least, the speaker's making a declaration. And because that deals with the speaker and tone, I highlight it in the same color. So the next step is to look at the shifts. And of course, there are a couple shifts here. The first one is after the very first stanza. Even though there's 3 sentences in this first stanza, they really are all describing the same thing. So I draw a line. After that, we have that section where the person is describing what spring should be doing, but then we have the declarative no. And I have clues with that. I was looking for full stops and any sort of transition words. In this case, it's that word now. Okay, so now I go back to the title, and I can see that it's not about fun or just a general description of winter. In fact, it really is about the oppressiveness of winter, that winter's power in that sense. I look back, for the final step, I need to come up with a theme, and I look back at my notes and my highlighters and the patterns that I've seen, and I think it has to deal with not just winter, but the idea of that these experiences that held us in long iron chains and are sharp and make us stumble and are associated with death and rotting and a predatory nature, that stays with us even after it's left. If we replace winter with the idea of a sad experience, perhaps the death of a loved one or a loss of some sort, then it makes a lot of sense that even once the experience is completed and gone, you would think that the person becomes cheerful almost immediately, but that's not the case. The person is still a captive held by those memories. And more than just that, these final 2 lines highlight that it's not a personal pain, a personal loss, but the effect of that experience on us actually changes the way that we interact with people.